January 1945. The war is still breathing, but its pulse is weak. Snow clings to the wooden barracks of a camp somewhere in western Germany. The ground is frozen hard, packed down by months of marching boots. Inside the perimeter, there is no shouting today. No barking orders. Only the sound of wind brushing against canvas and tin. German women officers stand in formation near the infirmary building. Their uniforms are still pressed. Their posture still rigid. But their eyes no longer scan with authority. They wait. Across the yard, American vehicles idle quietly. No fanfare. No raised weapons. From the trucks step women in unfamiliar uniforms. Clean, practical, marked with the insignia of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. They move with calm purpose. Clipboards in hand. Medical bags over their shoulders. An order is read. Brief. Procedural. Control of medical operations is transferred. There is no argument. No resistance. One by one, the German officers lower their gaze. Some grip their gloves too tightly. Others turn away, shoulders trembling. The moment is not loud, but it is absolute. What collapses here is not just command, but belief itself. And this moment did not come out of nowhere. It was built by years of war, ideology, and an approaching defeat that made scenes like this inevitable. WWII, the beginning of 1945, the Second World War had entered its final, grinding phase in Europe. What remained of the Third Reich was no longer fighting for victory, but for time. Allied forces pressed in from every direction, tightening a strategic vice that Germany could no longer escape. In the West, American, British, and Canadian armies had crossed into German territory following the collapse of the Ardennes offensive in January. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major counterattack, had failed at immense cost. German armored reserves were shattered. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Luftwaffe aircraft sat grounded, either destroyed or without pilots and aviation gasoline. The once feared German war machine had become a defensive force stretched thin across collapsing fronts. At the same time, the Allied command had shifted its priorities. Victory was no longer measured solely by territory gained, but by stabilization, securing supply lines, managing prisoners of war, providing medical care for soldiers and civilians alike. Entire regions were being overrun faster than they could be administered, forcing Allied planners to prepare for the immediate humanitarian consequences of liberation. Camps, some military, some auxiliary, some converted from earlier installations, began falling into Allied hands. These were not all extermination camps. Many functioned as holding centers for prisoners, displaced civilians, forced laborers, or wounded personnel. But nearly all shared the same features: overcrowding, malnutrition, disease, and rigid German administrative control that had long prioritized discipline over care. The United States Army had anticipated this phase of the war. As early as 1943, Allied planners understood that advancing armies would inherit millions of human lives in fragile condition. To meet that reality, medical units were expanded dramatically. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps grew to more than 59,000 women by 1945, deployed across field hospitals, evacuation units, and liberated zones. These nurses were not symbolic figures. They were trained professionals operating under military authority. Many had already served under fire in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. They understood mass trauma, infectious disease, and logistical triage. And as Allied forces advanced into Germany, their role expanded beyond treating Allied soldiers. The collapse of German military command structures created a vacuum, especially in medical administration. Officers fled. Records were destroyed. Supplies vanished. In some camps, German personnel remained only because there was nowhere left to go. Authority existed on paper, but not in reality. 4 German women officers stationed in these environments. The situation was uniquely unstable. They had been trained to obey hierarchy, to maintain order, to function within a system that promised permanence and ideological certainty. By early 1945, that system was unraveling. American nurses were not arriving as conquerors. They were arriving as caretakers. But in a defeated society built on control and obedience, the quiet transfer of authority carried a psychological weight heavier than any weapon. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, moments like the one in that frozen camp became not just possible, but unavoidable. The structure holding everything together was cracking. What remained was only waiting. Long before American nurses stepped through the gates of German-controlled camps, women had already been woven deeply into the Third Reich's wartime machinery. By necessity rather than ideology, the German military had expanded female auxiliary roles as the war consumed more men. These women were not frontline soldiers, but they were officers in function, if not always in rank, administrators, communication specialists, clerks, guards, and medical orderlies. Organizations such as the Helferinnen units supplied the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS with trained female personnel. Many were stationed at camps and installations far from the front. Their authority derived not from weapons, but from structure, uniforms, rules, schedules, and an unchallenged belief in the permanence of the system they served. Medical authority inside these camps followed German military doctrine. Efficiency came first, discipline second, individual comfort last. Care was procedural, often minimal, and tightly regulated. Compassion was permitted only when it did not interfere with order. German medical staff, including women officers and orderlies, were trained to maintain this balance with emotional distance. By contrast, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps operated under a fundamentally different doctrine. American military medicine emphasized stabilization, sanitation, and survival as strategic necessities. Disease was considered an enemy. Morale was a measurable factor. Cleanliness, nutrition, and rest were not indulgences. They were tools. When Allied forces liberated camps, the medical situation was often catastrophic. Typhus, dysentery, trench foot, frostbite, and untreated wounds were widespread. German records, when they existed at all, were frequently incomplete or deliberately destroyed. Supplies had been rationed to the point of dysfunction. Command chains were broken or contradictory. In these conditions, Allied commanders increasingly bypassed remaining German medical authority. Control of infirmaries and care facilities was transferred to Allied medical units, not as punishment, but as necessity. American nurses were placed in charge because they had the manpower, supplies, and organizational clarity to prevent total collapse. For German women officers, this transfer represented more than a change in procedure. It was a reversal of identity. Many had been raised and trained under a regime that equated order with moral superiority. The presence of foreign women, former enemies, issuing instructions calmly, professionally, without malice, created cognitive dissonance. These American nurses did not shout. They did not threaten. They reorganized wards. They discarded contaminated bedding. They reassigned duties. They took notes. They gave orders based on medical need rather than rank. In reports from early 1945, Allied medical officers noted emotional responses among remaining German staff: withdrawal, silence, visible distress. Some complied mechanically. Others broke down under the strain. Tears were not acts of defiance or performance. They were signs of psychological overload at the moment authority slipped away. The camps themselves became spaces of transition. Not yet peaceful, no longer German-controlled, suspended between collapse and recovery. And within that fragile space, the quiet arrival of American nurses set the stage for a turning point. One where power shifted not through force, but through competence and care. That shift would soon become undeniable. For the German women officers present in these camps, the end did not arrive with explosions or gunfire. It arrived with paperwork, with reassignment orders, with the sudden realization that the structure they had relied on no longer protected them. Many of these women had spent years maintaining control in environments defined by rigidity and routine. Their authority depended on predictability, morning inspections, scheduled rations, regulated movement. When American nurses assumed command of medical operations, that predictability dissolved. The rules were still enforced, but they were no longer German rules. Psychological studies of surrender environments conducted after the war identified a common pattern. Emotional collapse often followed administrative displacement rather than physical defeat. Tears, shaking, and withdrawal were typical responses when individuals lost not just status, but purpose. In the camps, this manifested quietly. Faces turned away, hands trembling as armbands were removed or instructions were ignored. Professional angle, medicine versus ideology. The contrast between German camp medical procedures and American military nursing was stark. German systems emphasize conservation of supplies, of effort, of emotional engagement. American nurses, trained in mass casualty environments, emphasized intervention. They washed wounds repeatedly. They isolated contagious patients. They demanded ventilation and clean water. This was not a moral performance. It was protocol. But to German officers, it appeared radical. Years of ideological conditioning had framed Allied forces as chaotic or inferior. Instead, they witnessed disciplined women executing complex medical logistics under pressure. Professional inadequacy, real or perceived, became impossible to ignore. The authority once granted by uniform no longer guaranteed respect. Competence did. Power angle, control without violence. Perhaps the most destabilizing element was the absence of brutality. Power changed hands without threats, arrests, or punishment. Orders were delivered calmly, sometimes through translators, sometimes through gestures. German women officers were neither humiliated publicly nor reassured privately. This neutrality stripped away familiar emotional defenses. There was no enemy rage to resist, no cruelty to condemn, only efficiency. In many cases, tears followed, not from fear, but from relief mixed with loss. The burden of maintaining failing systems vanished, but so did identity. The camp, once a symbol of control, became evidence of defeat. And as these human, professional, and power dynamics converged, deeper implications began to surface, ones that extended beyond individuals and into the moral and strategic fabric of the war itself. In the final months of the war, authority was no longer defined solely by rank or insignia. It was defined by who could restore life to systems on the brink of collapse. American nurses, operating under military orders, carried a form of moral authority that did not need to be declared. They enforced hygiene standards. They demanded accountability for patient outcomes. They recorded deaths accurately and insisted on transparency. In camps long accustomed to obscured numbers and procedural indifference, this shift was profound. German women officers who had enforced regulations without question were now witnesses to a different standard, one that measured success in survival rather than compliance. This moral authority was not accusatory. It did not reference ideology or guilt, but it implicitly exposed the emptiness of systems built on obedience alone. Enemy perception, the collapse of propaganda. For years, German personnel had been conditioned to view Americans as undisciplined, morally weak, or culturally inferior. Female American soldiers, in particular, were portrayed as unnatural or unserious. The reality in the camps contradicted every expectation. American nurses moved with quiet confidence. They worked long hours. They enforced rules firmly, but without cruelty. They treated German patients when necessary, following the same protocols used for Allied casualties. This professionalism dismantled propaganda at close range. For German women officers, the enemy no longer existed as an abstraction. It stood beside them, competent and unafraid. The psychological impact of this realization often manifested physically: trembling hands, lowered voices, tears that came without warning, quiet reversal, a different kind of defeat. What unfolded in these camps was not conquest in the traditional sense. There were no victory speeches, no flag ceremonies. Yet control shifted completely. Decisions about who received care, when, and how were no longer German decisions. The reversal was quiet but total. German officers remained present, but they no longer directed outcomes. Some assisted under supervision. Others withdrew entirely. The camp continued to function, but under a different logic. This form of defeat was harder to process than battlefield loss. It offered no moment of resistance or heroism, only acceptance. And as this acceptance settled into the daily rhythm of the camp, a decisive moment approached. One where the consequences of this transfer of authority became unavoidable, and the psychological weight of defeat fully crystallized. February 1945. The camp lay under a gray, overcast sky. Snow had melted into a slushy mixture that soaked boots and muffled footsteps. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere was taut, silence punctuated only by the shuffling of papers and distant coughing from wards. American nurses had arrived at dawn, not with fanfare, but with precision. Clipboards were opened, ward assignments checked, supply inventories reviewed. Each movement was deliberate. Every instruction had a purpose. The German women officers, standing in formation near the infirmary, watched with stiff expressions, their authority gradually being stripped away in the calmest way imaginable. An official order was read aloud by U.S. Lieutenant. Control of all camp medical operations was now under the Army Nurse Corps. Every detail, from ration distribution to patient assignments, fell under the new command. The German officers nodded automatically, but their compliance was mechanical. They understood the futility of resistance. As the nurses moved through the wards, assessing patients, reallocating resources, and organizing care teams, the women officers observed behaviors they could not control. Staff were reassigned without ceremony. Patients were bathed, fed, and treated with a level of attentiveness previously unseen. Every action reinforced a new hierarchy, one built on competence, not rank. Inside the infirmary, German women officers watch. Faces pale, fingers tightening around gloves, eyes darting to colleagues for reassurance, but finding only reflection of their own uncertainty. For months, they had managed this space with rigid rules, enforcing schedules, rationing supplies, dictating minor procedures with authority. Now that authority dissolves like frost in sunlight. Orders are read aloud, simple, clinical. All medical operations now under U.S. Army supervision. Maintain current patient lists. Follow new hygiene protocols. Report all incidents immediately. The sentences are calm, unembellished, but the weight behind them is unmistakable. Some German officers comply immediately, mechanically adjusting assignments or recording patient details as instructed. Others freeze. Some retreat into corners, wrapping themselves in the final remnants of pride and discipline. And a few, unable to reconcile the reversal, begin to weep silently, eyes fixed on the floor or the distant perimeter fence. The nurses move on, inspecting wards, redistributing supplies, and reorganizing staff. Each step reinforces the shift. Power has passed, quietly but absolutely, from one side to the other. The former enforcers are no longer decision-makers. They are witnesses. The camp, once structured entirely by German rules, now runs on a system they neither designed nor control. Even the soldiers stationed outside the barracks notice the change. The air feels different, less tense, yet heavier with unspoken acknowledgement. This moment, administrative yet profound, marks the first point of no return. From here, the collapse of authority is not gradual. It is inevitable. And as the last clipboard is set down, the camp holds its breath. What follows is the full psychological reckoning. A storm that had been building for months now has its moment to break. WWII late February 1945, the transfer of authority was no longer a procedural event. It had become a crucible. German women officers, who had maintained rigid control over daily operations, now faced the reality of their obsolescence. The fog outside the camp had lifted, but inside, a deeper, invisible fog of shock and disbelief lingered. One by one, the officers' composure cracked. A communications clerk, long trained to issue orders with precision, sat rigid at a desk as her hands trembled over the paperwork. Another, responsible for the infirmary roster, could not bring herself to rewrite it under American directives. The tension was silent, almost ceremonial in its intensity. American nurses moved steadily through the wards, reinforcing procedures and adjusting schedules with calm authority. Their presence was unyielding yet non-threatening, a paradox that left the German officers disoriented. The collapse was not sudden violence. It was cumulative realization. They were no longer at the center of decision-making. Their status, once validated by uniforms, badges, and obedience, had been quietly stripped away. Tears, subdued but relentless, appeared. Some women turned their faces to the wall, letting them fall unnoticed. Others pressed a hand to a trembling chest, trying to contain the emotion they had been trained to suppress. The breakdown was physical as well as psychological, a symptom of shattered purpose. Historians later noted that such moments were common in administrative surrenders. The loss of authority triggers profound identity crises. Outside, the camp's rhythm began to change. Patients received care promptly. Orders were followed without hesitation. Supplies were organized and accounted for. The efficiency of the American medical teams contrasted starkly with the frozen indecision of the remaining German officers. The contrast was more than operational, it was existential. In this moment, the psychological weight of defeat crystallized. The German women officers had not been captured in battle, nor forced into surrender by guns. They had been defeated by competence, by order, and by the silent authority of caregiving. Their ideology, their hierarchy, their pride, all had been rendered secondary to the immediate needs of survival and humane treatment. By the afternoon, the camp had settled into its new reality. Authority rested with the nurses. The German officers were present, but powerless. Compliance had replaced command, tears had replaced pride, and a quiet, reluctant acceptance had replaced defiance. The transformation was complete, and this transformation would define the camp for the weeks to come, shaping interactions, routines, and the broader perception of Allied authority. The moment of psychological collapse was over, but the consequences had only begun to ripple outward, affecting strategy, morale, and the unfolding history of post-liberation operations. In the days following the transfer of authority, the camp began to stabilize under American medical supervision. The presence of competent nurses ensured that routine operations, food distribution, sanitation, and medical care were no longer chaotic or dangerously inconsistent. Wards were cleaned methodically. Patients received regular checkups, and infection control measures were strictly enforced. Even minor wounds, long neglected under the German system, were treated promptly, reducing the spread of disease and preventing complications. The German women officers continued to occupy the camp, but no longer directed operations. Some are reassigned to assist with menial tasks under supervision, their compliance now procedural rather than voluntary. Others withdrew entirely from daily routines, lingering on the periphery, silently observing their former domain being reorganized by women they had once considered inferior or subordinate. Reports from U.S. Army observers noted the mixture of shame, relief, and disbelief etched on their faces. For the liberated prisoners and patients, the shift in authority was transformative. Previously, many had endured harsh schedules, minimal care, and emotional intimidation. Now, the nurse's presence introduced predictability and, for the first time, safety. Medical attention was impartial and systematic, measured by need rather than rank or ideology. Even German patients benefited from these procedures, creating an uneasy but functional equilibrium within the camp. Supplies, long rationed or mismanaged, were accounted for meticulously. Clean bedding, proper nutrition, and access to medicine were restored incrementally. The nurse's insistence on record-keeping revealed how much had previously gone unmonitored, highlighting the inefficiencies of the former German administration. The camp began to hum with a quiet order, a stark contrast to the rigid but failing system imposed by German officers. Beyond the physical improvements, the camp experienced a subtle cultural shift. The act of competent women assuming command challenged established norms and expectations. Where once obedience had been enforced through hierarchy and fear, authority now derived from knowledge, skill, and calm leadership. This created tension, but also fostered respect, even among those who had been trained to resist the enemy in theory. The immediate aftermath demonstrated a simple truth. Power without cruelty could achieve what force could not. The camp functioned better, morale improved, and the German officers, while still present, were relegated to witnesses of a system that had surpassed their capacity to control it. As the weeks passed, the effects of the authority shift became evident not just within the camp, but in broader operational and psychological terms. Reports from U.S. Army and Red Cross personnel highlighted a striking pattern. When competent, organized care replaced the failing German system, both human suffering and mortality rates declined sharply. Disease outbreaks were contained more efficiently, food distribution became equitable, and patient recovery accelerated. These improvements demonstrated the strategic value of placing skilled personnel in positions of practical authority, even in enemy-controlled spaces. For the German women officers, the long-term consequences were profound. Their identities, closely tied to authority and ideological structure, had been disrupted irreversibly. Many were reassigned to administrative tasks elsewhere or eventually repatriated, carrying the memory of professional disempowerment and emotional breakdown. Oral histories and post-war testimonies describe recurring feelings of shame, helplessness, and disbelief at the competence of the American nurses, a quiet, enduring mark of defeat that required no violence to instill. Psychologically, the camp's transformation challenged notions of dominance and hierarchy. The traditional markers of control, uniforms, armbands, and formal rank, proved insufficient when not backed by expertise, organization, and moral authority. Authority rooted in skill and responsibility, exemplified by the nurses, proved far more resilient and effective than authority enforced through intimidation or fear. On a strategic level, this event reinforced a critical lesson for military planners. The success of liberation efforts depended not solely on combat victory, but on the rapid and competent administration of care and order. Camps could not simply be seized, they had to be managed. Medical personnel, particularly experienced nurses, became frontline enablers of stabilization, ensuring that liberated populations survived and that chaos did not undermine military gains. The ripple effects extended to the liberated prisoners and local populations. Witnessing enemy officers reduced to compliance before professional competence reinforced the reality of Allied power, not only military, but organizational and humanitarian. This, in turn, influenced morale, behavior, and the speed of recovery in liberated zones. It was a form of soft authority, undeniable, effective, and transformative. By the time American forces pushed further east, camps previously under German control had been transformed into functioning centers of care. The combination of strategic foresight, professional discipline, and humane authority created environments where survival and recovery became possible, leaving a lasting imprint on both the individuals involved and the operational doctrine of liberation, in the quiet aftermath. The significance of what had occurred in that frozen camp becomes clear. Authority had shifted, not through violence, not through force of arms, but through competence, organization, and moral responsibility. The American nurses demonstrated that leadership is measured not by who commands fear, but by who ensures survival. For the German women officers, the moment marked more than a professional defeat. It was an existential one. They had been trained to equate obedience and hierarchy with purpose, yet found themselves powerless before skill and care. Their tears were not merely of shame, but of the profound realization that the structures they had trusted so implicitly were fragile, impermanent, and vulnerable to collapse under true competence. The camp, once a symbol of control, became a testament to the quiet power of human empathy combined with disciplined expertise. Lives were saved, disease contained, and order restored. not through punishment, but through clarity and action. In doing so, the nurses left an indelible mark on both the survivors and the former occupiers, a demonstration that authority grounded in humanity can be more enduring than authority grounded in fear. Looking back, this moment resonates beyond the camp walls. It illustrates a profound lesson for history, strategy, and humanity alike. Victory is not only measured by the battles won, but by the care taken for those left in the aftermath. The quiet competence of women in uniforms, once underestimated, redefined the terms of power, leaving a legacy that outlasted the war itself. The echoes of that day endure. Tears shed not for defeat alone, but for the fragile collapse of a system that had demanded loyalty above all else. And in that collapse, a new order, defined by skill, compassion, and quiet authority, took its place.